By the winter of 1944, the German army on the Eastern Front was collapsing. What had once been a disciplined, unstoppable force was now a scattered collection of exhausted men, rusting tanks, and empty fuel barrels. Snow and mud swallowed entire convoys. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had stormed across Europe in lightning wars, was now retreating, step by step, village by village, before the relentless advance of the Red Army. For many German soldiers, it was no longer about winning. It was about surviving another night. Supply lines had been cut, food was scarce, and ammunition was rationed down to the last bullet. The smell of burning oil and frozen corpses filled the air. On the outskirts of East Prussia, makeshift camps appeared where mechanics and engineers struggled to keep what was left of the army's vehicles running. The war machine that once amazed the world had become a dying beast, bleeding oil and fuel onto the frozen ground. Each tank, truck, and half-track that could still move was worth more than gold. Mechanics worked day and night, scavenging parts from destroyed vehicles, welding armor plates by candlelight, and praying that engines would start in the freezing dawn. Corporal Ernst Mahler, a 28-year-old mechanic from Bavaria, stood knee-deep in mud next to a broken Opel Blitz truck. He had been repairing machines since the beginning of the war, but now his hands trembled not from cold, but from hopelessness. He knew this truck wouldn't make it far. There was no fuel and no spare tires. His unit had been promised supplies weeks ago, but the roads were either bombed, blocked, or swallowed by the Soviet advance. Everywhere he looked, soldiers were tired and silent. The laughter and songs that once echoed through the camps were gone. The only sounds now were the distant thud of artillery and the groan of overworked engines. The Eastern Front had become a graveyard of machines and men alike. At dawn, Muller watched a convoy of retreating soldiers pass by. Their vehicles, half frozen and patched with scrap metal, moved slowly, leaving behind trails of black smoke. Among them were horse-drawn carts carrying wounded men, their faces pale beneath blood-stained bandages. A soldier muttered, "This isn't war anymore. It's survival." Further east, Soviet Katyusha rockets screamed through the sky, raining down fire and shrapnel. Each explosion shook the frozen ground and scattered pieces of German equipment into the air. The Wehrmacht's once perfect coordination had turned into chaos. Communications failed, orders contradicted each other, and divisions were surrounded before they even knew it. The mechanics, like Muller, were the unseen backbone of this dying army. They didn't fire rifles, they fought with wrenches, fuel pumps, and bare hands. When trucks broke down, they crawled under the freezing chassis to patch holes with metal scraps and cloth. When engines seized, they poured alcohol, even melted snow, into radiators. Anything to make them run one more kilometer west. But deep inside, Muller and his comrades knew the truth. Germany was running out of time. Every kilometer gained by the Soviets was another nail in the coffin of the Reich. And yet, orders kept coming from Berlin. Hold the line. Fight to the last man. One night, as the blizzard howled through the ruins of a Polish village, Muller sat by a dying fire with his fellow mechanics. They shared a single can of beans between 5 men. Someone whispered, "Do you think they'll ever send reinforcements?" No one answered. They all knew reinforcements weren't coming. The Western Allies were advancing from the other side. The East was burning. In the distance, a column of flames rose into the night sky, fuel depot hit by artillery. The fire illuminated wrecked vehicles, twisted metal, and frozen soldiers who would never wake again. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow. By morning, the retreat continued. Muller climbed into what was left of a half-functional Opel Blitz and tried to start the engine. Coughed, rattled, and finally came to life. He looked at the horizon, gray, endless, and cold. Somewhere beyond it, home still existed. But the road there was closing fast. The Eastern Front had become a nightmare from which there was no escape. The Wehrmacht was no longer an army of conquest. It was an army of ghosts, driving broken machines toward a fate they could not change. And yet, even in that desperate struggle, men like Müller kept fighting. Not for Hitler, not for glory, but for the man beside them, and for one more day of life. Behind every tank, every armored column, and every blitzkrieg offensive, there were men who never appeared in propaganda films, the mechanics of the Wehrmacht. They were the unseen backbone of Germany's war machine, the ones who kept engines running long after factories had stopped producing. While generals moved pins on maps, these men fought a different kind of battle against mud, frost, and the slow death of machinery. When the war began in 1939, the Wehrmacht prided itself on organization and precision. Every division had its repair unit, Werkstatt company, equipped with tools, spare engines, and mobile workshops mounted on trucks. Mechanics followed the troops wherever they went, setting up camp in fields and ruined barns, turning any available space into makeshift garages. They were the grease-covered soldiers who never slept, always hunched over broken engines under the dim light of kerosene lamps. When tanks returned from combat, riddled with bullet holes and burned wiring, it was the mechanics who worked through the night to make them fight again by dawn. First, it worked. German vehicles, especially the Panzer divisions, were the envy of the world. The blitzkrieg through Poland and France depended on flawless logistics. If a Panzer broke down, a repair truck was never far behind. In those early years, the mechanics were confident, proud, and well-supplied. But everything changed on the Eastern Front. The distances were endless. The mud, the snow, and the cold turned engines into steel coffins. By late 1942, most repair companies were operating with less than half their required spare parts. Soviet shells destroyed supply depots faster than they could be rebuilt. Fuel became rarer than water. In one sector near Smolensk, a repair crew led by Sergeant Hans Weber worked for 3 days straight to rebuild a Panzer IV using parts scavenged from 3 destroyed tanks. When it finally roared back to life, the men cheered, not because they had saved the war effort, but because it reminded them that something still worked. The life of a Wehrmacht mechanic was brutally hard. They were soldiers, but they didn't fight on the front lines. They lived just behind them, under constant threat of artillery and air raids. Many died without ever firing a weapon. Others froze to death while trying to repair engines in -30-degree weather. Wehrmacht engineers had to improvise constantly. When rubber hoses burst, they wrapped them in leather. When bearings wore out, they melted down scrap metal to cast new ones in makeshift molds. They burned alcohol, kerosene, even potato oil when fuel was gone. Every vehicle that moved westward in 1944 was a small miracle of desperation and ingenuity. Mechanics shared a strange brotherhood. They came from every corner of Germany. Farmers, machinists, students, and car enthusiasts turned soldiers. They spoke in the language of metal, torque, pressure, heat. In the chaos of retreat, they formed tight-knit groups who trusted each other with their lives. Private Wilhelm Schneider, a 22-year-old mechanic from Hamburg, once wrote in his diary, "We fix what's broken, but we can't fix the war. Every time we repair a truck, another is lost to bombs. Still, we keep working. Maybe because it's all we can do." By 1944, many Wehrmacht workshops had become scavenger camps. Mechanics stripped abandoned enemy vehicles, British, Soviet, even American, for anything that could be reused. Tires, fuel pumps, spark plugs, nothing was wasted. Some German trucks ran with mixed parts from 3 different nations. But every repair took longer and every success felt smaller. The glory of the early war had turned into silent endurance. Commanders demanded impossible results. while Berlin kept sending orders detached from reality. "Keep the panzers operational," they said. But how, when even the grease had frozen and the roads were gone? And yet, these men persisted. They rebuilt wrecks under fire. They pushed immobilized tanks by hand. They risked their lives to pull damaged vehicles from no man's land because every machine counted. To lose one was to lose ground, and to lose ground was to die. In the final months of 1944, entire units were reduced to a handful of functioning vehicles. Most kept alive only because of their mechanic stubbornness. Those men no longer believed in victory. They believed in duty, in craftsmanship, and in survival. When the shells stopped falling, and the engines finally went silent, the mechanics of the Wehrmacht were left among the ruins, surrounded by twisted steel, burned oil, and memories of machines that once symbolized power. They were the last caretakers of a dying empire, men who had built and rebuilt the same engines until the world around them collapsed. Their story is not one of conquest, but of endurance, a reminder that even in war, not every soldier fights with a weapon. Some fight with their hands, their minds, and their will to keep something moving, even when everything else has stopped. By the autumn of 1944, the roads of Eastern Europe were no longer pathways of conquest, they were corridors of retreat. German convoys crawled westward through endless mud, snow, and destruction. The same highways that once thundered with the power of blitzkrieg now echoed with the grinding noise of broken engines and squealing wheels. The Wehrmacht's once proud motorized divisions were falling apart. Every journey became a gamble. Trucks ran on bald tires, tanks moved on half-broken tracks, and motorcycles sputtered forward on fuel mixed with anything that would burn. Mechanics called it the Road of Ghosts. Miles of silence punctuated only by distant artillery and the cries of stranded men. Fuel convoys that once kept the front alive were gone. Allied bombers had turned refineries, bridges, and supply depots into smoking craters. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect transport columns. Every mile meant risk of ambush, air raids, or simple mechanical death. On the empty roads, wrecked vehicles lay scattered like tombstones of a dying army. Sergeant Hans Weber, the head of a small Werkstatt repair team, kept a notebook of every machine they lost. By December, the list had grown so long he stopped writing. "It's useless," he muttered one night. "Tomorrow there will be 10 more. Weber's men traveled in an old Opel Blitz that served as both workshop and shelter. Inside, every inch was filled with tools, cables, scraps of metal, and the smell of burned oil. They had become scavengers, driving from one battlefield to another in search of anything that could still be used: bolts, bearings, even strips of rubber cut from enemy tires. They followed retreating units, stopping by the wrecks left behind. Some vehicles were burned to skeletons. Others were simply abandoned when the fuel ran dry. German mechanics tore through them with surgical precision, removing usable parts and marking the rest with chalk. Verloren, lost. One day, near a destroyed bridge in Poland, Weber's crew came across a column of abandoned Panzer IVs, half buried in snow. The engines were intact, but there was no fuel, no battery power. They stripped radios, gears, belts, anything that could be carried. Then they set fire to the hulls so the Soviets couldn't use them. The flames painted the white snow in shades of orange and black. Private Muller, the same Bavarian mechanic from before, stood watching the fire. "We're not soldiers anymore," he said quietly. "We're grave diggers for machines." Every repair now required ingenuity bordering on madness. When spare spark plugs ran out, mechanics filed down spent ones and reused them. When oil filters clogged, they replaced them with fabric soaked in alcohol. They turned destroyed Allied vehicles into treasure troves, a British carburetor here, an American alternator there, all stitched together into Frankensteins of German engineering. The command structure barely functioned. Orders came too late, often from officers who had no idea what conditions were really like. A message might say, "Prepare 30 vehicles for redeployment," but there were only 5 left that could even start. The rest were silent hulks scattered across the countryside. In one village near Brest-Litovsk, Weber's men found an old barn filled with abandoned Wehrmacht trucks. The villagers had stripped them for wood and metal. Still, the mechanics searched every corner. They found a single working transmission, half a crate of bolts, and a rusted fuel pump that could be saved with careful cleaning. To them, it was as valuable as gold. Nights on the road were worse than the days. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Men slept under vehicles, wrapped in tarps and blankets soaked with oil. Every morning, they had to light small fires under the fuel tanks just to thaw the diesel enough to start engines. Their breath froze in the air as they turned wrenches, their fingers cracked and bleeding from the cold. The hunt for parts was endless. They moved from wreck to wreck, from ruin to ruin, never knowing if the next day would bring supplies or death. Sometimes they encountered retreating infantry units who begged for transport, but Weber's crew had no space to give. "If we stop," he told them, "nothing moves anymore." One morning, they found a stretch of road littered with German and Soviet vehicles, all destroyed in the same ambush. Smoke still rose from the craters. In the middle of the wreckage, a half-burned Soviet truck still had intact tires. The mechanics worked in silence, removing them quickly. Above them, crows circled in the gray sky, black shadows against the snow. Weber looked at the horizon and whispered, "This is what the end of a war looks like." By early 1945, even the scavenged parts were running out. The empty roads stretched westward, carrying the remnants of the Wehrmacht. Engines wheezing, axles screaming, men too tired to speak. Each kilometer gained was not a victory, but a delay of the inevitable. The German army had once been defined by its precision, its speed, its power. Now it was defined by what was left behind: burned-out shells, twisted steel, and men searching for pieces of a machine that no longer existed. And yet, in that wasteland of metal and snow, the mechanics kept going. Because as long as one engine still turned, there was still a reason to move forward, even if there was nowhere left to go. By February 1945, the roads of eastern Germany were filled with the wreckage of war: burned-out tanks, frozen horses, and shattered convoys. The air smelled of diesel, smoke, and despair. The retreat had become endless. For Sergeant Hans Weber and his small band of Wehrmacht mechanics, each day began the same way: searching for something, anything that could still move. Their old Opel Blitz repair truck was barely running. The engine coughed like an old man, the tires were smooth as glass, and the transmission whined with every turn of the wheel. They knew it would not survive another 100 kilometers. The men drove in silence through the forests near Poznan, the last light of day casting long shadows across the ruined road. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, they saw it. Half hidden behind a snowbank and a line of shattered trees stood a truck, unfamiliar, larger than anything they had. Its olive-drab paint was covered in frost, and a white star still faintly showed on the door. "Americanish," whispered Mahler, stepping closer, rifle ready. It was indeed an American vehicle, a GMC CCKW, one of the famous deuce and a half trucks used by the Allies. Somehow it had ended up here, deep inside territory once held by the Germans. Perhaps it had been captured from a supply convoy in France, or abandoned after a chaotic retreat in the Ardennes. No one knew. What mattered was that it was intact. Weber climbed onto the driver's side, brushing snow from the windshield. "It's beautiful," he muttered, half in disbelief. The cabin was clean, the seats made of real leather, the instruments simple and clear. Compared to their worn-out German vehicles, this was another world. They opened the hood. Inside was a six-cylinder engine, larger than anything they had seen in a standard Wehrmacht truck. The design was straightforward, robust, and clearly made for endurance. No complicated fittings, no fragile parts, just raw practicality. Private Schneider checked the fuel tank. "There's still some left," he said, amazed. "And look, spare jerrycans in the back." Within minutes, the crew began working. The oil was thick and frozen, but the engine looked sound. Muller cleaned the carburetor while Weber primed the fuel line. When they turned the key, the starter whirred weakly, then stopped. The battery was dead. They stared at each other for a moment. Then Weber smiled faintly. "Let's bring her back to life." For the next 3 hours, under the pale light of a single lantern, they worked in near silence. They used a spare battery from their Opel Blitz, patched the ignition wire with copper scavenged from an old radio, and drained the frozen fuel line. Every breath formed clouds of steam in the air. Their hands were numb, their faces burned by the cold. But none of them wanted to stop. When the moment came, Weber turned the key again. This time, the engine coughed, once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, steady growl. The sound filled the forest, echoing between the trees. For a brief moment, the men forgot the war, the cold, the hunger. They had done the impossible. Muller laughed out loud. "She lives." Weber nodded, staring at the running engine in awe. "Look at it," he said quietly. "It's simple, powerful, built to last." As they examined the vehicle further, their amazement turned to reflection. The GMC's construction was solid but not over-engineered. It was designed to be produced in huge numbers, repaired easily in the field, and driven by anyone with basic training. The Germans, by contrast, had built their machines to perfection, but at the cost of time, resources, and complexity. "This is how they win," Weber said finally. "Not just with soldiers, but with trucks like this. Thousands of them, all working." They loaded what tools and supplies they could into the back and decided to move west using the American truck. It was faster, smoother, and stronger than anything they had driven in years. On the icy road, the GMC rolled forward like a beast awakened from sleep. As the miles passed, the realization sank in. Every detail of the truck, its efficiency, its ease of use, its reliability, spoke of an enemy whose industrial power had already decided the outcome of the war. Germany, with all its brilliant engineers and precision designs, could not match the sheer scale and simplicity of Allied production. Later that night, as the men camped near a burned-out farmhouse, Weber sat by the fire and stared at the truck's silhouette against the moonlight. "That machine," he said softly, "is the end of us." No one argued. They all knew he was right. The GMC wasn't just a truck. It was a symbol of how far behind they had fallen, and how impossible it would be to catch up. As the fire crackled and the cold crept in, the men fell silent. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered. But for now, the truck stood quietly, a captured heartbeat of the enemy, and a reminder that Germany's war was already lost, even if it hadn't yet admitted defeat. The next morning, the men awoke to the sound of a steady engine humming in the cold air. Frost covered the truck, but its heart, the captured GMC, was still alive. Weber stood beside it, arms crossed, a faint smile on his face. "She made it through the night," he said quietly. "Now let's see what she can really do." The Wehrmacht mechanics had tested hundreds of vehicles during the war, German, Soviet, even captured Allied models. But none had made such an impression so quickly. The GMC truck felt different. It wasn't elegant or over-engineered. It was built for war. Not the kind fought on the maps in Berlin, but the kind fought in mud, snow, and chaos. Weber climbed into the driver's seat. The key turned with a confident click, and the engine responded instantly, without the choking struggle they were used to from their own machines. "Listen to that," he said, tapping the dashboard. "Smooth, steady, like it was built to keep going forever." Muller and Schneider inspected the rest of the truck. The suspension was strong but flexible, the axles reinforced for heavy loads. Every bolt seemed standardized, identical in size, a mechanic's dream. Even the tools in the small compartment were simple and universal, designed for field repair without specialized equipment. "This thing was made to be fixed anywhere," Muller said, shaking his head. "We need an entire workshop to replace one part. They just need a wrench and a hammer." They decided to take it for a real test. The men loaded their supplies, and Weber shifted the transmission into first gear. The truck rolled forward easily, the tires gripping the snow-covered road. Within minutes, it was cruising steadily across the frozen countryside. No sputtering, no vibration, no loss of power. As the truck moved, the men inside could hardly believe it. The steering was smooth, the gears shifted without grinding, and the brakes held strong even on ice. For years, they had driven vehicles that groaned, rattled, and fought against them. But this machine, an enemy truck, felt alive, cooperative, almost friendly. They pushed it harder. The GMC climbed muddy slopes that would have stopped an Opel Blitz dead. Powered through deep snowbanks without losing traction. When they stopped and restarted, the engine fired up every time, obediently, without hesitation. Weber looked out the window at the snowy forest rushing by and muttered, "If we had 10,000 of these, maybe the war would have gone differently." By midday, they stopped near a frozen river to refuel and rest. Schneider examined the engine compartment, still warm from the drive. "It's so simple," he said. "No complex valves, no fragile parts. You could teach a farmhand to repair this." Weber nodded slowly. "And that's exactly what they did. The Americans built machines for ordinary men, not for engineers." He thought back to the factories in Germany, the endless obsession with precision, the pride in perfection. Every German vehicle was a masterpiece, but it came at a terrible cost. Time, materials, and maintenance. The GMC, by contrast, was a workhorse, designed to be built fast, repaired easily, and replaced without ceremony. As the men ate their rations by the riverside, they talked quietly about what they had learned. Meller, the youngest of the group, asked, "Do you think they know how good their machines are?" Weber smiled bitterly. "They don't need to know. They have thousands more just like it. That's the difference between us and them." In the afternoon, they ran more tests, braking, load capacity, even towing one of their damaged half-tracks. The GMC handled it all with calm strength. The suspension absorbed every bump, and the engine didn't falter once. By evening, they were silent. The excitement of discovery had faded into a heavy realization. This truck, this simple machine from across the ocean, represented everything Germany could no longer match, not in technology, but in practicality, in production, in power. As the sun set, Weber stood beside the running truck, listening to its rhythmic engine. "We spent years chasing perfection," he said softly. "They built victory." He turned off the ignition. The engine stopped immediately, no sputter, no aftershock. Just quiet efficiency. The silence that followed was almost painful. That night, as they sat around a small fire, the conversation turned somber. They spoke not of battles or victories, but of machines, of factories that once roared in the Ruhr Valley, now reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. They remembered comrades who had died pushing broken trucks through snow because there were no spare parts left. The GMC stood nearby, its metal glinting in the firelight. It seemed almost alive, a mechanical reminder of a world that had already moved on from them. Schneider finally said, Maybe we're not just losing the war on the battlefield. Maybe we lost it in the factories long ago. No one answered. The wind blew through the trees, carrying distant echoes of artillery fire. Weber stared at the truck one last time and whispered, "This machine will outlive us all." The men nodded silently, each lost in thought. For the first time, they truly understood that Germany's defeat wasn't just written in blood and battles. It was written in steel, in engines, in the quiet hum of a foreign truck that simply refused to die. The following morning was unusually quiet. The sky hung low with heavy gray clouds, and the air smelled faintly of oil and frost. Weber's men stood around the captured GMC truck, notebooks and tools in hand. Today was not about driving, it was about learning. Weber crouched by the open hood, his gloved hands tracing the smooth lines of the American engine. "Every piece," he said, "is where it should be. No wasted space, no unnecessary complication." His tone carried both admiration and disbelief. Schneider handed him a wrench and added, "And every bolt is the same size. Can you imagine that? You could disassemble half the truck with one tool." In the German army, vehicles were built like watches, complex, precise, and fragile. Each model required specialized parts, unique tools, and mechanics trained for months. But this American machine told a different story. Function over form, efficiency over elegance. As they dismantled a section of the engine, Weber noted how the components were labeled with clear numbers and arrows. Even a soldier with little technical training could follow the instructions. It was as if the truck had been designed to teach itself to anyone who touched it. "They built this for soldiers, not engineers," Muller said. "Back home, we design machines for perfection. They design them for survival." Weber didn't answer. He was lost in thought, staring at the sturdy metal parts that fit together with effortless precision. Each component was simple, but together they formed a system that worked flawlessly, a testament to the American philosophy of mass production. Nearby, Schneider spread a few pages of captured documents over a crate. They showed assembly line sketches and production notes from Detroit. Thousands of identical engines, produced day and night, shipped across the ocean in perfect synchronization. He looked up from the papers. "This is how they beat us," he said quietly. "Not with better soldiers, with better factories." Weber nodded slowly. "In Germany, we craft every vehicle by hand. In America, they build them by the hour." As they continued their inspection, they found more to admire. The electrical wiring was color-coded and sealed against water. The fuel lines reinforced but flexible, and even the air filter was easy to remove and clean. Every part screamed of practicality. By midday, the snow began to fall. The men worked under a tarp, their breath fogging the air, their gloves slick with grease. Yet none of them wanted to stop. The GMC wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a revelation. Muller turned the crankshaft slowly, watching how effortlessly it rotated. "No resistance," he said. "No strain. It's almost too simple." Weber replied, "That's the point. When something breaks, it doesn't cripple their army. They fix it and move on." The realization hit them like a silent explosion. This was the true weapon of the Allied forces, not just tanks or planes, but machines built for endurance, backed by factories that never slept. After hours of testing, the men sat in silence, gathered around a small stove for warmth. Weber took out his field journal and began writing slowly. "The American truck is not superior because it is perfect. It is superior because it is enough. Every part serves its purpose, nothing more, nothing less. It is built to last, not to impress." He paused, looked at the others, and said, "That's their secret. Simplicity." Schneider smiled faintly. "And we Germans never learned it." As night fell, The distant thunder of artillery echoed through the forest. The war was still raging somewhere beyond the hills, but in that small clearing, the men felt they had discovered something far greater than any tactical victory. They had seen the future, and it did not belong to them. Weber closed his notebook and stood, brushing the frost from his coat. "When this war ends," he said, "machines like this will rebuild the world, and we'll be the ones studying how they did it." He walked toward the GMC, its dark shape glistening under the falling snow. For a long moment, he stood there silently, then placed a hand on the cold metal hood. "They didn't just build a truck," he said softly. "They built a message." Schneider asked, "What kind of message?" Weber looked at him, the snow melting on his face. "That power isn't about who fights harder. It's about who builds smarter." The men packed their tools and prepared to move out. The truck started instantly, its steady hum cutting through the cold evening air. The sound was comforting, like the heartbeat of a civilization that knew no exhaustion. As the GMC rolled forward through the snow, the men inside sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. They had tested the enemy's machine, and in doing so, they had learned something their generals never would. They had seen the difference between a nation that built for glory and one that built for victory. And in that realization, they understood that the war's outcome had already been decided, not on the battlefield, but in the factories of Detroit, long before a single shot was fired. The morning after their engineering revelation, the air was colder, sharper, the kind that bit into the skin and reminded the men they were still in a war zone. Frost glistened on the captured GMC truck, coating it like armor. The soldiers moved quietly, conserving both energy and fuel. Their unit had received radio orders from headquarters. All captured vehicles were to be reported and delivered for official evaluation. But Weber's men hesitated. The truck had become more than a machine. It was their lifeline. Fuel was scarce, food even scarcer. Their German trucks were either broken, frozen, or stuck in the mud miles away. The GMC, however, started at the first turn of the key every single time, carried their tools, rations, even wounded comrades. It was quite literally keeping them alive. Schneider stared at the map spread on the hood. "Headquarters wants us to bring it back," he said. "But if we do, we'll have nothing to move with." Weber rubbed his temples, silent. He knew the regulations. Disobeying orders meant court-martial, even execution. But he also knew the truth. Without the GMC, his men wouldn't last a week in these frozen woods. Muller muttered, "To them, it's just another piece of equipment. To us, it's worth more than gold." The others nodded. They all knew it. In a war collapsing under its own weight, this single American truck symbolized survival. By midday, the men decided to delay their report. They would keep the GMC for now, under the excuse of testing enemy technology in the field. It was a risk, but in the chaos of retreating armies, paperwork was often the first casualty. They loaded the truck with scavenged supplies, a few fuel drums, crates of canned meat, and ammunition stripped from abandoned depots. As the engine roared to life, Weber felt a strange sense of triumph. The sound wasn't just mechanical, it was defiance. For days, they drove through shattered villages and bombed out bridges, the GMC bouncing steadily over frozen terrain. Other German units they encountered stared in disbelief at the American vehicle. Some laughed, others simply looked envious. In one encounter, a passing officer demanded to know why they were using enemy equipment. Weber saluted smartly and replied, "Because it works, sir." The officer didn't argue. He simply nodded, weary, and moved on. At night, the men huddled around the truck's flatbed, using it as shelter against the wind. They spoke little, each was lost in thought. Around them, Germany's once mighty war machine was crumbling, But this single truck kept moving, unstoppable. On the fifth night, Schneider whispered, "You know, when the Americans built this thing, they probably never imagined it'd be saving Germans." Weber smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what makes it powerful. It doesn't care who's driving it. It just does its job." But beneath that calm, a quiet tension grew. They all knew the end was coming, and with it, questions about their loyalty, their actions, and this captured prize. Would they be accused of theft? Of cowardice? Still, Weber couldn't bring himself to surrender it. The GMC had become a symbol of something greater, the realization that true strength lay in what could endure, not just what could destroy. One afternoon, as they refueled near a burned-out farmhouse, Muller found a battered German staff car half buried in snow. Inside was a stack of reports, lists of units destroyed, cities lost, fuel depots gone. He handed one to Weber. "Look at this," he said quietly. "It's all falling apart." Weber scanned the pages, his expression hardening. "We're fighting ghosts now," he said. "All we can do is stay alive." He looked back at the GMC. Its olive-drab paint was chipped, its fenders dented, but it still ran smoother than any German truck left in the region. Later that evening, as the sun set over the snowy fields, Weber wrote in his field journal again, "The men call it our gold truck. They are right. In these days, gold cannot feed us, cannot carry the wounded, cannot move us forward. But this truck can. It is not a trophy. It is survival itself." That night, distant explosions echoed across the horizon. The front line was moving again. Weber gathered his men. "We move east," he ordered. "Avoid the main roads. Stay invisible." The truck's headlights were kept off as they drove under the pale moonlight, the engine humming softly like a heartbeat. The men inside were silent, each one aware that they were no longer fighting for Germany's victory, only for their own existence. When dawn came, frost sparkled on the windshield like glass dust. The GMC climbed a hill, overlooking a vast plain scattered with the remains of retreating columns. Smoke rose in the distance, the war's dying breath. Schneider broke the silence. "Do you think we'll make it home?" Weber didn't answer right away. He looked at the horizon, then at the truck's dashboard. The gauges steady, the engine unwavering. "If we do," he said finally, "it'll be because of this machine." The men nodded. For the first time, they understood something profound, that this American truck represented everything Germany had failed to achieve: reliability, simplicity, and unity of purpose. As the GMC rolled forward once more, its tires crunching over ice and debris, Weber thought to himself, "This isn't just a machine of war, it's a machine of survival. And survival, that's all that matters now." In that moment, surrounded by the ruins of a collapsing empire, the captured GMC truck truly was worth more than gold. Snow fell heavily that morning, covering the wrecked landscape in a deceptive calm. The men awoke to silence, the kind of silence that only follows destruction. Their GMC truck sat under a thin blanket of frost, its engine still warm from the night before. Weber stood beside it, looking toward the east, where columns of black smoke marked the retreating German lines. The war was unraveling thread by thread. Fuel convoys had vanished, bridges were gone, and headquarters no longer answered the radio. The once proud Wehrmacht was splintering into isolated pockets, each group fending for itself. Yet the American truck still moved, its steady hum a reminder that some machines were built for endurance, not glory. As the men prepared to move, Schneider kicked at the snow and muttered, "The roads are dead. No supply trucks, no reinforcements, nothing." Weber nodded grimly. "It's over for us. We just haven't been told yet." They drove through a ruined village, roofs collapsed under snow, windows shattered by shellfire. A burned-out German Panther tank lay on its side, its turret blown open. Next to it, a convoy of American vehicles rolled past on a parallel road, shining, organized, endless. The sight froze the men. Dozens of GMCs, Jeeps, and Sherman tanks moved like a living river of steel. The sound of their engines blended into a single mechanical roar that drowned out the world. Weber whispered, "Look at them. Not a single one broken." Muller leaned closer to the window. Every truck the same model. Every one moving. How can anyone fight that? It was the first time they'd seen the Allied machine in full motion. Not in stories, not in captured scraps, but with their own eyes. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Each truck carried supplies, food, ammunition, and behind everyone was a factory, a worker, an industry untouched by bombs. Weber's thoughts drifted to his homeland. Factories in ruins, cities in flames, engineers scattered or dead. What were they fighting with now? Bride? Memories? He remembered the early years of the war, when the German army seemed invincible, when victories came fast, when the soldiers believed in destiny. But now, destiny was driving on for American wheels. That night, they camped in the woods near a frozen river. The men sat around a small fire, the orange glow flickering across their tired faces. The captured truck stood nearby like a loyal guardian, its metal sides reflecting the flames. Schneider broke the silence. "Do you remember when we thought one Panzer could hold back an entire division?"
Müller chuckled bitterly.
"Now we'd be lucky to hold back one of their convoys." Weber didn't join in. He stared into the fire, lost in thought. "We built for perfection," he said quietly. "They built for numbers, and in the end, numbers always win." He reached into his coat and pulled out his journal, the pages worn and smudged. By the firelight, he wrote slowly, "The American war machine is not beautiful, but it is unstoppable. It moves like time, constant, patient, inevitable. We built masterpieces. They built machines that never stop moving. That is why we will lose." The men fell silent. Outside the circle of light, the forest creaked under the weight of snow. In the distance, they could hear the faint rumble of artillery. Not close, but coming closer every night. Over the following days, they saw more evidence of Germany's collapse. Refugees filled the roads. Civilians with carts, soldiers without weapons, officers without orders. Everyone was moving west, away from the front, away from the truth. At one crossroads, they passed a group of teenage soldiers, the Volkssturm, boys armed with old rifles and panic. One saluted Weber as they passed. He couldn't bring himself to return the gesture. When they stopped to refuel, Schneider said what they were all thinking. "All of this," he gestured to the truck, "the snow, the endless retreat. It's already decided. No speech from Berlin can change it." Weber nodded. "We're watching the end of an empire. Not from the outside, from the driver's seat." That night, they climbed a hill to get their bearings. From the top, they could see for miles the glow of burning cities, the moving lights of Allied columns advancing without pause. The earth itself seemed to tremble with the weight of their engines. Weber turned to his men. "You see that? That's what victory looks like. Not parades, not medals, just movement. Constant, endless movement." No one replied. They all understood. In the stillness, Weber placed his hand on the GMC's hood, feeling its quiet vibration. "This truck," he said softly, "wasn't just built to win battles. It was built to win wars. That's the difference." Snow began to fall again, thick and slow, as if trying to hide the truth beneath its white silence. As dawn approached, they packed their things and started the engine once more. The truck moved forward, steady and unbroken, even as everything else around them crumbled. Weber looked out the window, whispering to himself, "Germany can't win, because this," he gestured toward the horizon filled with Allied vehicles, "is what winning looks like." The realization wasn't filled with drama or anger, only a deep, heavy acceptance. The kind of acceptance that comes when there's nothing left to fight for, except the faint hope of survival. And as the sun rose over the shattered landscape, the American truck, their captured miracle, rolled on, carrying them through the ruins of a war that had already been lost. By late February 1945, the Wehrmacht was no longer an army, it was a shadow of one. Command lines had broken, communication was chaos, and soldiers wandered the countryside without orders, searching for food, shelter, or simply a way home. Weber's small group drove their captured GMC through what was left of Germany's Eastern Front. The once paved roads were now nothing more than frozen scars, littered with burned-out tanks and the twisted remains of what used to be convoys. The truck's tires crunched over debris, helmets, crates, even rifles abandoned in the snow. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. The radio had gone dead days ago, and no one bothered to fix it. Orders no longer mattered. The war had become a slow, inevitable collapse. Schneider broke the silence first. "Do you think Berlin still stands?" Weber didn't answer. He simply stared ahead, his eyes hollow. The truth was too heavy to speak aloud. They passed a column of wounded men on foot, soldiers wrapped in torn blankets, some dragging themselves on makeshift crutches. One carried a sign that read, "To the West." Another pushed a bicycle loaded with rations, a single helmet hanging from the handlebar. As the GMC rumbled by, the men turned their heads, eyes empty but full of recognition. These were comrades, survivors, ghosts of an army that no longer existed. Meller whispered, "We used to be an unstoppable force. Now we're just trying to escape our own war." Further down the road, they came upon a field filled with abandoned artillery. Dozens of howitzers and anti-tank guns stood silent, half buried in snow, their barrels pointed uselessly at the sky. A single sign read, "No ammunition." Weber stopped the truck and climbed down. He walked among the silent guns, brushing snow off the cold metal. Once these cannons had thundered across Europe. Now they were nothing but relics, monuments to a dying empire. He murmured, "So this is how it ends. Not with explosions, but with silence." That night, they camped near the ruins of a bombed farmhouse. The walls were blackened, the roof half gone. Inside, they found a few frozen potatoes and a rusted pot. It was enough for a thin soup. Around the fire, the men spoke softly, their words carried away by the wind. Schneider said, "My brother was on the Western Front. He wrote to me in December, said the Americans had everything. Fuel, food, new boots for every man. He said it felt like they could fight forever." Muller stirred the pot. "And us? We can't even fight hunger." Weber sat apart, staring into the flames. In his hand was his field notebook, now nearly full. He wrote one final line. "The Wehrmacht has not been defeated by courage or lack of it, but by exhaustion. By an enemy who never ran out of fuel, and by a nation that ran out of hope." The next morning they drove again. The road westward was crowded. Soldiers, civilians, even horses pulling carts of refugees. The sound of crying children mixed with the rumble of distant artillery. Every village they passed looked the same. Houses burned, windows shattered, flags torn from their poles. At one crossroads, they found a group of officers trying to organize a defense. They waved at Weber's truck to stop. "You there, is that an American vehicle?" One shouted. Weber saluted sharply. "Captured equipment, sir. Still operational." The officer's face was covered in soot. Keep it that way, he said. You'll need it more than anyone. Weber nodded, but inside he knew the truth. There would be no counterattack, no miracle. Only surrender or death. Later that day, they passed through what had once been a supply depot. Now it was a graveyard of machinery. Hundreds of trucks and tanks lined up, stripped for parts, engines silent. The smell of diesel and decay hung in the air. Schneider muttered, "Even the machines have given up." Weber replied softly, "Machines don't give up. Men do." That night, snow fell again. The wind howled through the broken windows of the farmhouse where they rested. In the distance, they could hear the low rumble of tanks, not German but American. The men exchanged looks. None of them spoke, but all knew what it meant. The war was no longer coming. It was already here. Weber closed his notebook, his last entry written with shaking hands. The Wehrmacht has collapsed. What remains are fragments of men and metal, scattered across a frozen land. The war that once promised glory now offers only survival. Tomorrow we will drive west, not to fight, but to surrender. At dawn, the sky glowed faintly red, not with sunrise, but with fire on the horizon. The air was thick with smoke and the faint sound of engines approaching. Weber climbed into the driver's seat of the GMC, his men silent beside him. As the truck started, the engine's hum felt almost human. Steady, determined, alive. They drove toward the west, toward whatever fate awaited them. Behind them, the last echoes of the Reich faded into the distance. And in that moment, the realization was complete. The proud Wehrmacht, once feared across continents, had finally fallen. Not in one great battle, but in 1,000 small defeats, scattered like ashes across the snow. The morning of their surrender was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The sky hung heavy with low clouds, the kind that swallowed sound and made the world feel distant. Weber's men had driven through the night, their captured GMC humming like the last heartbeat of a dying empire. The snow along the roadside was churned by tank treads and boots. Every few kilometers, they passed abandoned rifles, broken helmets, even white flags tied to sticks, signs that the German army was laying down its arms piece by piece. At dawn, they saw it, the first American checkpoint. Sandbags, barbed wire, and a line of soldiers in clean uniforms, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The contrast was striking. The Germans looked like ghosts. The Americans looked like the future. Weber slowed the truck. The men inside exchanged glances. Tired, nervous, silent. No one spoke, but they all felt the same thing. The war was over. He stopped the engine, stepped out, and raised his hands. "Nicht schießen," he called. "We surrender." An American sergeant approached cautiously, his rifle at ease but his eyes sharp. He looked over the truck, then at the men. Ragged uniforms, hollow faces, frostbitten hands. "You boys had enough?" he asked in English. Weber nodded. "Yes, it's finished." The sergeant studied the GMC for a moment, then smirked. "Funny thing," he said, "you're the first Germans I've seen driving one of our trucks." Weber almost smiled. "It never failed us," he said quietly, "even when everything else did." The Americans disarmed them, checked for hidden weapons, and led them to a small holding area. There were dozens of German soldiers there already. Some young, some gray-haired, all equally defeated. A few sat on the ground, staring at nothing. Others shared cigarettes with their captors, the war momentarily forgotten. Weber's men were ordered to park the GMC nearby. As they stepped away, they couldn't help but look back at it. The machine that had carried them through snow, fire, and the end of their world. Schneider said softly, "It feels wrong to leave it, Weber rested his hand on the fender one last time. "We borrowed it from history," he said. "Now we give it back." The Americans quickly realized the truck was still in perfect condition. One of them climbed inside, turned the key, and the engine started instantly. The sergeant grinned. "Runs smoother than half the ones we've got," he said. Weber felt a strange sense of pride. Even in defeat, his men had cared for that machine as if it were their own. By noon, the prisoners were lined up and marched toward a nearby barn converted into a temporary camp. The air smelled of hay, smoke, and diesel, the scent of both peace and captivity. Inside, the men sat against the walls, listening to the distant rumble of Allied convoys rolling east. For the first time in months, no one was shooting, no one was shouting, and no one was dying. The silence felt unfamiliar. Schneider looked at Weber. "So this is it? After everything?" Weber nodded slowly. "Yes, this is how wars end. Not with victory, but with understanding." He took out his field notebook, the same one he had carried since the beginning, and turned to the final blank page. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote, "We are no longer soldiers, but witnesses. We have seen what happens when machines outlast men, when industry defeats ambition. The American truck we drove was not just a vehicle, it was a message. It told us the future belongs to those who build, not those who destroy." As the sun set, a young American soldier came to check on them. He couldn't have been more than 20. His uniform was clean, his boots new, his rifle shining. He offered Weber a cigarette through the wire. Weber accepted, lit it, and exhaled slowly. The smoke drifted upward, mingling with the fading light. "You're lucky," he said in broken English. "You fight for something that still exists." The American didn't reply. He just nodded and walked away. That night, the barn was cold but quiet. The men slept on straw, their bodies finally surrendering to exhaustion. Outside, the GMC truck stood parked among other Allied vehicles, indistinguishable now from the rest. Just another piece of machinery in a war that had consumed millions. Before closing his eyes, Weber looked through a crack in the wooden wall and whispered to himself, "It carried us farther than we deserved." In the days that followed, they were transported west, toward larger POW camps. The journey was long but strangely peaceful. The guards shared food. The prisoners no longer dreamed of escape, only of home. As the train rolled across the countryside, Weber thought of all they had seen. The frozen roads, the burned cities, the silent guns, and the single truck that had defied it all. He opened his notebook one last time and wrote, "War ends not when the last shot is fired, but when men finally understand what they've lost. We built weapons. They built endurance. And in the end, endurance always wins." When the train crossed into the Allied zone, he closed the notebook and slipped it into his coat. The snow outside was melting, the first signs of spring creeping across the fields. For the first time in years, Weber felt something he hadn't known since before the war: relief. Not joy, not victory, just relief that the killing was done. And somewhere in a nearby motor pool, an American mechanic turned the key of a weathered GMC truck. The engine came to life instantly, steady and strong. He smiled and said, "Runs like new." He didn't know its history, or the men it had carried through the ruins of Germany. But if that truck could speak, it would have told him the truth. That in the final days of the war, it carried not just soldiers, but the last remnants of a broken nation, on their road from battlefields to peace.